Welcome to Determine Out Loud, our podcast series that's all about minding your business in contract management and source to pay. And now, your host, VP of Product Marketing for Determine, Constantine Limberakis.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our latest iteration of Determine Out Loud. Today, I have another special guest, as always, who's joining us from Connecticut, but who's a world and global traveler. His name is Tim Cummins. He's the CEO of IACCM, which is the International Association of Contract and Commercial Management. So, Tim, welcome to this iteration of Determine Out Loud. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Tim. Tim is like I mentioned, a global traveler. He's been around as part of being a CEO of IACCM and the founder. And as part of his function, he's seen so much about what's happening in the changes of contract management, commercial management, and what that means from both a process and technology perspective. And we thought it would just make a ton of sense to really have a conversation with Tim because of all the things that he's seeing and experiencing as part of the contract management world. So, Tim, one of the things that we were just curious about as from a Determine perspective is what are some of these key trends that you're seeing in contract management today? I mean, you just got back from Hong Kong, you were in London, you're seeing this globally. So talk a little bit about that for me.
Yeah, thank you. I think you touched in a way on two of the critical pieces here, one of them being around process, the other one being around people. So we are seeing a dramatic increase in executive interest in the field of both contract and commercial management, those two really being very much interconnected. For us, commercial management is really about the policies and practices that determine an organization's broad capabilities, and the contract is, of course, in many ways an expression of those capabilities. The two need to be absolutely interlocked. And in many organizations, they're not well interlocked. And in many organizations, contracts today can actually often frustrate corporate goals, corporate strategies. They become misaligned. You know, we're seeing a marketplace where organizations need to be far more agile. They need to be much more flexible. They need to be creative. They need to develop commercial innovation in order to compete with the rapid changes that are going on through volatile market conditions. Contracts typically, as you well know, are not really designed to have those types of characteristics.
Yeah.
So executives are seeing that sort of challenge, if you like, in terms of the mismatch between what they need to do as a business versus what their contracts are currently enabling. And that, certainly from a process point of view, is leading them to really try and think, how do we alter it?
Yeah.
From a people point of view, of course, it's also leading to a lot of questions over how do we equip the people we've got and how do we equip the organization more generally to develop these more agile, flexible capabilities. How do we really build commercial and contracting competence into the business?
Yeah, those are some really good points. You know, it's this, like you said, this combination of these elements that make it more than just the legal black and white, what's written on paper. And, you know, I think our perspective, you know, Tim, we're looking at this from a technology standpoint. We're looking at addressing that as part of the stakeholders that need to try to automate and digitize the process. But, you know, at IACCM, you guys are looking at this in so many different capacities. So what is IACCM trying to do to help practitioners to adjust to, you know, this change that you've seen in contract management?
Again, I suppose at both of those levels, we are certainly working more and more at senior levels around this issue of what does competence look like. So we provide a lot of support, particularly to our corporate members, through things like capability maturity assessment, which looks not at the function, but looks at the process. How do organizations need to design and develop processes that will support the flexibility and agility and speed that they recognize that they need. And as you rightly point out, one of the critical ingredients all of this is absolutely understanding technology. Technology is driving much of the need for this greater flexibility, but of course it's also the solution to it. And as you well know, the traditional investments that people have made have often been the antithesis of flexibility and agility, and the need for much more dynamic contracting systems that give far better business intelligence is becoming of critical importance. So one aspect, as I said, doing things like capability assessments around process. Another element is a massive increase in the advisory work that we're being called upon to help organizations understand the nature of the technology they should be implementing, to support greater flexibility and performance in their contracts, and to stop a lot of the value erosion that occurs. And then thirdly, of course, the training of people. But increasingly not just the training of the professional procurement contract management staff, but also a much wider array of people, project managers, engineers, etc., in terms of their commercial awareness and some of their underlying ability to manage contracts, particularly in the post-award environment.
So you bring up an interesting point about, the changes that are happening. And one of the things that we've experiencing is this notion of self-service, wizard-driven. I need just some real basic functionality to get an NDA in place, or I need to take some very core steps, but I don't need to necessarily get everybody involved in that process. And you mentioned this kind of broader usage of getting involved in contracts. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? How have you seen this trend of expanding contract management to a wider group, getting people more involved in knowing what's in those contracts and how legal or say procurement or even sales interact with that framework? What are your thoughts on that self-service notion?
Yeah, the fascinating tensions in business. I mean, we've seen 20 years when a lot of the focus was really on standardization and control. And then we saw all these fears of, the regulatory compliance issues, which reinforced this belief on the part of some that, the future was all about being, if you like, compliance officers and managing rule books and making sure that everything got reviewed and approved and stopping all this rogue spending. And I mean, that's a completely unsustainable model. It never was a sustainable model. Businesses, of course, needed to invest in control instruments and control capability. But absolutely now the pendulum has swung to say, having made those investments, we now need intelligent agents at the center of the core of the business that are all about enabling users. It's user enablement, which is the future. That's a big shift for many of those, particularly in all of the commercial groups, if you like, whether it be finance, legal, procurement, contract management. They have to start thinking of themselves as being business enablers, not business controllers.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. And we've seen quite a huge increase in that interest in saying we want the flexibility and capability with those controls, but being able to enable our users and then further drive the return on investment in whether it's the process that you're trying to reinvent or the digitization of the through the technology that you're trying to do. And maybe along those lines, what are your thoughts on this notion also of the combinations of things like, say, supplier management combined with contract management? I know that's something that you guys started out with. You did some work in that area at IACCM. What are your thoughts on the ability to combine some of those dynamic processes together, say from an onboarding of a supplier to the ability to make sure that the contract is compliant? What have you been seeing there? Has there been an increased discussion around vendors and supplier management as part of contract management?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention it because I was, in fact, just this morning having a conversation with our head of learning on exactly those topics. Old habits die hard. Organizations still like to try to define themselves with these fairly rigid functional divisions. And of course, every time a new discipline arises, whether it's something like, outsourcing or alliances or whatever, people always want to be special. They want to be a standalone group that is somehow divorced from the rest of the business and has some specific expertise. And we're seeing much the same conflict and challenge, of course, with things like SRM as a discipline. Absolutely, I think the the future is going to drive organizations to fundamentally rethink organizations that are built around new, far more versatile and adaptive technologies. As we see the introduction of artificial intelligence, the power of some of the advanced analytics, et cetera, that is going to drive different ways that organizations structure. And one of the fundamentals we believe, and one of the phenomenal and exciting opportunities for people, is the evolution of a much more integrated trading relationships function that will potentially bring together, and you could look at it as a shared services unit, I guess, but really bring together those commercial skills to be the gearbox for the organization in implementing business strategy. It's going to have to be far more adaptive, far more collaborative, and absolutely focused on business enablement rather than just business control. It is control through enablement rather than seeing those two as being in conflict.
Yeah, those are some really great points. I'm going to put you maybe here on a spot for my last question. If there's one thing that you're most excited about for the future of, contract management, commercial management, being the head of this organization is kind of, representing the industry. What would you say that is? What would you say that one thing is that you're so excited about?
I think the thing that I would have to choose right now is really this push towards standards. It's the recognition that contracts actually are fundamental to trading relationships and, in that sense, to sort of human endeavor. We're having, for example, early conversations with people like World Economic Forum because of the understanding increasingly of the role that contracting practices play in the whole challenge that we've got today of social trust. That actually many of our contracting practices, for example, is just one of the ingredients that diminishes trust between societies, within society, and from people through to institutions. That's driving, along with the technology, of course, that now enables it, far more analysis that says actually much of the stuff we do today in contracts is just adding to complexity and risk. It is not reducing it. Yep. And as we begin to utilize these powerful tools using things like natural language processing, we can begin to see that actually our archaic medieval methods of constructing and drafting contracts are really a massive degradation to the potential for better trust, better communication. Yeah. And importantly, we just need to and can begin to address this development of standards whereby the focus of negotiation and discussion will increasingly be on issues of principle, not words.
Yeah. Well, maybe it'll start by getting the lawyers to get rid of Microsoft Word as their crutch and focusing on the wider technology. But that's going to take some time. But Word has got its purpose. Why don't I ask?
Just as a quick example of that, we have a consortium of major corporations at the moment where we're doing precisely that, and where we're beginning to create codification that uses digital technology and doesn't use Word. So this world is actually very, very close. It is already beginning to happen.
Yeah, it is quite exciting. Maybe what we could do is you could just briefly touch, Tim, on the IACCM Americas conference that you have going on in Toronto in November. And I think you're going to be talking about a lot of these things, and we're going to be there ourselves. Maybe you could just talk just quickly about that, just for the folks that will be listening to this podcast.
Indeed, so I think as hopefully both of us have explained, understanding the way that technology is going to be impacting this field is absolutely critical to organizations and to, of course, individuals who work in this space. So contract tech is an absolute critical component of the conference, but of course it isn't the only one. We're also dealing with the more day-to-day immediate issues, we recognize that people need to have a good understanding of what's happening and where things are going so that they can personally prepare and can prepare their organizations. But at the same time, of course, we also need to address a lot of the more immediate day-to-day challenges. So people are going to have the opportunity to really get into a lot of case study examples and illustrations of many of today's issues at the same time as really getting that in-depth understanding of where things are moving to.
Yep. Well, that's great. We really look forward to being there, and hopefully those of you that are listening will be able to join as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Tim, for joining me on this call. I had a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Bye-bye, everybody.